So everyone focuses on the deficit. Supply side economics, Keynesian economics, it all gets lost. Everyone agrees the deficit's got to go. President Clinton comes in, taxes are raised. Did the increase in the tax rates close the deficit and lead to surpluses? I think to some extent they did, but also remember the economy grew very rapidly, and when the economy grows rapidly, plenty of income, plenty of revenue, plenty of tax collection. Along comes the year 2000. Bill Clinton is the incumbent. Who's the Republican challenger? George W. Bush, right? Jr. He is elected, and in the year 2001, when he takes office, he advocates tax cuts. He gets the tax cuts. Now, you can see the massive deficits, but does President Bush advocate the tax cuts on a supply side basis or on a Keynesian basis? Some of you say Keynesian, some of you say supply. Actually, he does both. For both. He says it'll stimulate demand and it'll stimulate production. He says both. Why not? I mean, why not? And so we did get the tax cuts, and now there's a considerable debate about whether they should continue. By the way, were the tax cuts oriented mainly toward the upper income folks or mainly toward the lower income folks? Mainly toward the upper income folks. The upper income folks received the largest benefit of the tax cuts. Which way the deficit in the long run? There's considerable pessimism that the deficits will continue to grow and the gap won't be closed. As you know, Mr. Benjamin Bernanke, who is now the current chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, testified just this week that he was very pessimistic. Testified before Congress. He was very pessimistic that the budget deficit will loom larger and larger. It's a real issue. And of course, the larger and larger the budget deficit, the more and more we rely on, of course, the more and more we rely on borrowing, obviously to meet expenses, and therefore interest costs rise, and the larger and larger share of interest expense among total expenses, and therefore you can imagine that one day, of course, interest costs become a larger and larger burden. And so the point is that if interest costs become larger and larger burden, then you're just paying more and more interest, and that in itself raises the expenses. So it is a problem. Politically, are those who advocate Keynesian tax cuts, are they politically to the left or to the right?
Sounds like both.
Well, when the Keynesian cuts government spending in order to stimulate demand, and the tax cuts go primarily to the low-income earners. To the left, the Democrats. The supply-side tax cuts, principally Republican. So there has been a battle over the tax cuts traditionally between the left, excuse me, advocating Keynesian tax cuts for the lower income folks, and the right advocating supply side tax cuts for the upper income folks. The problem is just lately, if you're getting to it, is that the deficit has become so large and so large a political issue that now what's happened is the Democrats have taken upon themselves to stop advocating tax cuts and focus more on the deficit once again. And the Republicans, of course, since they are in office, in the executive office, they are stuck, of course, now with the consequence of President Bush's tax cuts, inaugurated and advocated for both supply side and demand side, that is Keynesian reasons. So right now, what's happened politically is the whole tax cut issue has migrated to the point now where the Democrats are the party of fiscal responsibility and the Republicans are the party of tax cuts. Whereas once upon a time, in the early 60s, the opposite was true. The whole thing has flipped around. When President Kennedy was in office 45 years ago, he advocated tax cuts. Republicans called them fiscally irresponsible. Today, 45 years later, President Bush advocates tax cuts. The Democrats call them fiscally irresponsible. So it's a moving target, moving political target. Yes, Alan.
On the issue of the federal expenditures and the effect of the military expenditures as distinguished from all the rest of the expenditures, do these charts include the military expenditures?
Yes. This is everything. This is all of it. So, so this is it. And so actually the deficit is relatively small compared to the private borrower, right? But remember this, the projections that go out far into the future show the deficit growing. And so, of course, what makes it a political issue is the question is, how is the gap ever going to be closed? And who is going to pay the interest cost in the meantime? Because that's part of the expenditure, the expense. If Chevron Oil borrows heavily, that's private borrowing, in order to explore for oil, you and I don't worry about that. Because that's Chevron Oil's business, and assume they do it for business reasons, and if they can't repay their debts, then the consequence falls on the on the stockholders. When it comes to federal borrowing and federal deficits, then the consequence falls on us. We're the stakeholders. And so it's a different issue. Yes, sir?
From the Keynesian viewpoint of economics and the federal spending, with a disproportionate federal spending on military, does it achieve the Keynesian goals of stimulating the economy?
The question was, what about the military spending in the Keynesian view? I would focus strictly on the size of the spending and the deficit, and not focus on the breakdown between military and other. Let me tell you why, if I could, historically. During the 1930s, President Roosevelt advocated a large federal increase, a large federal spending increase, oriented toward public works programs, dams, bridges, and so on, other public works, despite the federal deficit, in order to employ the unemployed. In those days, federal spending was about $10 billion annually, revenues about 8, deficit about 2. So federal borrowing was about 2. Those programs helped but they did not eliminate unemployment.